A very good morning to everyone, and it's great to have you for the second day of the Citizenship, Sectarianism, and Belonging, the CPAD conference, of course, which is organized by the CPAD project, Carnegie funded, and it's great to have you. Discussion for today: space, social order, and citizenship. It's great to have three guest speakers today, and we have Aziz Al Jahshan, and he got a PhD from University of Essex and a key fellow of the CPAD, a fantastic lineup, and he was a former lecturer of politics and international relations at University of Essex. And as I said, he's a current fellow with CPAD, very active and interactive one. He leads the Middle East researcher. He was the lead Middle East researcher on the MOR project on mapping dictatorships. And we have Bibasrita Deb. I hope that I made myself clear in pronouncing it. Where Bibasrita Deb, she hails from the northeast Indian state of Assam. She is trained in the discipline of political science and takes keen interest in topics related to citizenship, statelessness, and migration. And she is currently enrolled as a doctoral scholar in the Department of Politics, University of Otago in New Zealand, where she's mainly researching the application of statelessness in the Indian Federation. Finally, Javier Guarado, a PhD scholar at Georgia State University, where he studies social movements in the Gulf during the global 60s. He was a guest speaker at the Dutch Flemish Institute in Cairo during fall 2020. He also holds a master's in contemporary Arab and Islamic studies from the Autonomous University of Madrid. Thanks so much for being there. And I can imagine I'm looking at the schedule to make it fairly stick to it. We'll start with Aziz. Talking to us about the sexy title, the Saudi Big Brother, the Saudi Big Other, Symbolic Ordering, and the Saudi self-regulation. Apologies for my mishaps. It's too early, in a way, after a long day of yesterday. So, Aziz, the floor is yours, please. I think, Aziz, you're muted. I think, yeah.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Sorry about that, everybody. That's just the thing, the COVID saying, I guess. So okay, I'll start. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mustafa, for the introduction, and it's such a pleasure to be with everyone here today. So just as Mustafa introduced me so I'm going to look at the Saudi Big Other. And what is this Big Other? What is it? It could be a big brother, it could be a big other. But then I think my title changed as I was preparing for this. So I wanted to add the discourse of appropriateness and self-regulation. So now can everyone see the screen?
Yes, that's
yeah, okay, thank you. Good. So I want to start off with the motivations first, and the questions and the aims. So for me, the motivation, because I'm a Saudi Arabian, so for a very long time, I was just fascinated with politics, and I could say my upbringing was different. I was brought up in the States in a time when people didn't travel to the States, and so I was not adverse to challenging perceptions and challenging. And I think throughout my time living in Saudi, I couldn't help but notice whenever people spoke about political issues, about foreign policy decisions, I could not help looking at their response and how they immediately jolt up and start to, in general, begin to perform the answer, not just give the answer, give the explanation, but there is this element of saying what is appropriate and saying what is almost expected of them. So that's what really made me want to delve into this idea a bit more. And so the question that I ask here is, why do Saudi citizens generally participate in an unchallenging manner with the social political space, or within the social political space? And I say generally here because people do challenge, they take up the space, especially when it is provided for them to take it up. And the aim of today, and the aim of this paper, when this paper, by the way, I'm doing it with, it's part of another paper that I'm working with my friend Melissa Carlson from the United States. So of course, I just wanted to mention that also. So the aim here is producing a lens slash approach, and I'm not sure if I want to produce a framework yet. I mean, I'm still in the making. So producing a lens approach that explains the various symbolic social political interactions. So I just want to have a brief general literature review of what led me to the big other, and the Lacanian notion of the big other. And so firstly, when we look at authoritarianism, or we look at Saudi Arabia and trying to understand this social political interaction, when we look at the literature of authoritarianism, they do offer explanations, but they do offer it in ways of how, in generally it's very top down, and how the ruling elite or the structure or the regime co-opts, how it crushes dissent, how it controls narratives, and times buys loyalty, which overlaps with the rentier literature. I don't think in this literature there is enough agency given to the social actors within this social political space. Now, when we look at Saudi-centric studies, in general, it aims to look at the social, economic, political nuances, the relationships, and what we can ascertain from that is the significance of Islam, or in the Islamic symbols, and how prominent it plays a role, or how much of a prominent role it plays in Saudi society, Saudi political space, social political space, etc. And so I think my aim here is to expand upon the symbolic notion. So before we look at what is the symbolic terrain, what is this big other that I'm talking about, it's very difficult. The challenge is to understand this idea of big other. And I wish I had this slide after, but never, I will speak about it anyways. That the social political space in Saudi Arabia is very difficult to understand, in my opinion, because there's a lot of symbolism, there's a lot of official rules, there's a lot of precedents where people, sometimes could get arrested for saying something that they thought was not controversial. Sometimes people do controversial things and they don't get arrested, and they don't get, these precedents and actions cause for a great deal of confusion. How can we understand this? But I thought this was very important here. So this is Article 39 of the basic law of governance in Saudi Arabia. Mass media and all other vehicles of expression shall employ civil and polite language. So language is important, but this idea of polite language, this idea of appropriate language is important. And I think this is what I wanted to expand upon. But what adds this layer of confusion also is that you do have sometimes gestures from the ruling elite that offer this space, that invite challenge, that actually call for it. So now we're going to look at this symbolic order. Okay, so I'm going to look at the symbolic order, and then I'll go back to this slide. So my bad. So the symbolic order and the big other is an idea that I borrowed from, is a Lacanian idea from Jacques Lacan, and from the work that I've been reading on Slavoj Žižek. And in his work, he uses and very much explains the complex ideas of Jacques Lacan. And he says the following: the big other is the symbolic order, society's unwritten constitution, is the second nature of every speaking being. It is here, directing and controlling my acts. It is the sea I swim in, yet it remains ultimately impenetrable. I can never put it in front of me and grasp it. It is as if, and this notion of as if is important, we subjects of language talk and interact like puppets, over speech and gestures dictated by some nameless, all-pervasive agency. So I think what I can get from this is this idea that it is this ominous force, that we are all part of this symbolic order here, and even the ruling elite themselves are part of this symbolic order. And what can also be ascertained from this too is that it's not necessarily an order that tells you what you can't and cannot do, or what you can and cannot do, but it is an order, a feeling, if you like, that could suggest what we should and should not do, or what we ought to and ought to not do. And what I could get from this is the discourse of appropriateness. Now, here I need to make some progress. Here, in this slide, I wanted to look at there are three processes that takes place. The gesturing, that is usually done by the ruling elite. The absorption and rectifying process, which happens in the mid-level, which I explain who they are. And then there's the self-regulation, which happens at the citizen social level. So this is now the terrain of the symbolic order and the levels of the symbolic order. So gesturing. There are two aspects here that the ruling elite, in my opinion, have the way how they maintain this appropriateness and this symbolic order. Empty gesturing, and I put it in quotations here because Žižek uses it as an emptying or empty gesture, but I don't necessarily think there is empty gestures. I do think there are gestures. What makes it empty is the fact how people use it. What makes it empty is the fact that while the gesture is there for challenge, for feedback, for etc., people don't take it from the social level, don't act upon it enough. And therefore, that's what makes it empty. And the reason why I call it empty is because there are challenges. There are appropriate challenges and have been appropriate challenges, which I will talk about in a little bit. But say, for example, what do I mean by this? In this, very authoritative hierarchy, it's very interesting to hear something like, the King Salman say something along the lines of, "May Allah bless those who show my shortcomings to me. That here you are, please tell us, give us." And I remember even hearing this and saying, wow, that's very interesting. He said, no, that the ear is working, the phone is here, the majalis, the audiences are there. I'm here to listen. So here is a gesture of inviting this criticism but how do people take it? And another aspect of gesturing here is something I call robust humility, where, and we can see that throughout the symbolic order, and so throughout how people interact, and particularly at the ruling elite level. So the name of the official name of the king, the title, is the servant. A lot of people say custodian of the holy mosques, but in Arabic it's khadim al-haramain. I think servant of the two holy mosques is more fitting, or that is more accurate. Here, there's something that the Crown Prince himself said. Yep, thank you. The Crown Prince, former Crown Prince Mohammed bin Naif, once said in a meeting, saying, you know, I heard that many people say that I'm going to come here and visit you because I want to raise your morale, and actually, you are the ones that are going to raise my morale, and that's why I'm here. And then all of a sudden you get this collective gasp of, oh my goodness, this is a wonderful thing that you just said here, you know. And what this does is that it actually re-entrenches this hierarchy, but it is done through this symbolic gesturing that I find, you know, because it is appropriate at this level. I need to make some progress. So I'll talk about disguising symbols of real power. So what this essentially does is that it disguises symbols of real power, which entrenches the symbolic order. So that's at the ruling elite level. And I think now this is the mid-level. And who they are people that are technocrats at the ministerial level who are not royals. And they function, they have a particular function in this symbolic order. And one of this functions is that they absorb criticism. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, there is particular criticisms at times. There are times where people take up this criticism, particularly the former Crown Prince, when someone challenged him and said, listen, if you don't do anything about the terrorist bombings that are taking place in Qatif, then the government is part of this. So this was a challenge, but nothing happened to the person. So there are challenges, that's what. But the challenges of authority is a lot more in this mid-level. So here are people, this is Turki al-Sheikh, he's someone who oversees the tourism in Saudi Arabia. And I argue he plays this particular role of absorbing the criticism, absorbing this particular, this energy of criticism. And there's another aspect or process that takes place at this mid-level, which is rectifying. And what I mean by rectifying is that these people, these technocrats, these ministerial ministers, non-royal ministers, are very easy to get rid of. And they immediately, they could be easily getting rid of, which then is a symbolic act in itself. That so now here the symbolic, the hierarchy is maintained through this action. So they are indispensable. Their indispensability, in other words, maintains, perpetuates the social order. And there are plenty of examples of this, and I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A. And I think the last slide. Don't worry. I'm on my last slide. Is this level of the social and the self-regulation here? And in this area, there are two trajectories. There's the bottom up, and there's the bottom bottom. And I think the bottom up here is very fascinating because there's this theatrical gesturing, and the work of Lisa Wadeen on Syria is very, very interesting here and very helpful. And while she looks at Saudi Arabia, she looks at Syria, I would like to take some of these ideas and apply it to Saudi Arabia. But here, this gesturing and this notion of the big other, this thing that people talk to, address, can be seen in this poster here. So here's a poster that is up in the street, and it says, Sallim wa Aman, yani Salman, which is something about safety and Salman, which it rhymes. But for me, the most interesting part here is that at the very bottom, which is Sam'an wa ta'a sayyidi, which is listening and obeying, sir. That this is now an addressing to this person, sir. What I argue is that this addressing is not necessarily to the king himself, because I don't think people know that the king is going to pass by here. Instead, what I argue is that it is addressing this big other, that it is talking to this appropriate reference point, this reference point that is appropriate. So this is the bottom up. And lastly, I would like to look at the bottom, or there's a lot of bottoms going on here, but there's the bottom and the discoursing appropriateness. And I got this idea of discoursing appropriateness from Mustafa, who I'm working with on our special issue. But here, there are this discoursing of appropriateness through symbolic reference points. And this takes place between the people and how they interact with each other. And usually what takes place is that this, I'm sure you could see the slide here, that these reference points, that sovereignty is a red line, obeying the guardian, ta'at al-wali amr, listening and obeying, as you can see in the other picture, are usual reference points that people say, okay, that can be contingent. But alongside this discourse, alongside this discursive terrain within the symbolic order, is this conspiracy, that there's always people conspiracizing or trying to get us or targeting us. And so when with the Saudis, when you ask between in this inter-Saudi discussions, they're saying, listen, okay, I think, you know, I understand very much that human rights is important. I understand very much that space and discussion is important. We understand these things, but not now, because there is a conspiracy against us. So what this does to this terrain, to this discursive symbolic terrain within the bottom level, is that it curtails the space and it kind of makes it smaller at times, alongside making these reference points of obeying the guardian, sovereignty is the red line, listening and obeying, very rigid and fixed. And that's why I think the rigidity and fixity of meaning is very much articulated in the Essex School of Discourse Analysis. So conspiracy is something that creates that contingency within that bottom discursive space within the social, in the social level. That's my I've concluded now. That's my presentation, and I really look forward to you know, people's responses and feedback, because you know, we're trying to make this a paper, hopefully. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm so glad that I presented.
Thanks, Aziz, and I imagine there will be a massive interest in this symbolic politics and intricacies of it along the big brother lines, which you insightfully explained. Before we moving to Debra Sita, I would love to introduce our fellow Anne Christine Rom, the fourth that we have joining us, and thanks for bearing with us on the late introduction, and is a PhD student at the Department of Political Science at Aarhus University. Her research focuses on civil society, how that civil society can contribute to the sectarianizing socio-political life in divided societies. In her dissertation, she looks into the various strategies anti-sectarian social movements in Lebanon, Bosnia, Herzegovina. She wrote some briefs and parts of reposts on CPAD. You can find them. How these movements used to oppose sect-based politics and promote political communities that transcend sectarian divides, and is holding a bachelor's degree in political science from University of Copenhagen and another master's degree in international studies from Aarhus University. Academically, she has a great interest in intercommunal conflict identity, politics, social movements in non-democratic settings and Middle Eastern relations. And I'm sure that you can find the profile of Anne on our page, CPAD page, among other fellows, of course. Welcome, Anne. It's great to have you for the topic that comes on Lebanon, of course, as a key area of her interest in perfect solidarity across time and space, sources of unity and division in Tripoli during the Lebanese October uprising. We are looking forward to it. And then we move to Barasita. We have the PowerPoint. I'm gonna play it. So I'm at your own request. Once you ask me to move around with it. So what I'll do is I'll share the screen, and here you go with the citizenship, and I'll make it full. Just 1 second. Can you please, anyone give me a sign that you can see it? Perfect.
Yes, we can see it. Yeah.
The floor of yours, Debastrita, and please feel free to ask me to change it once you want.
Yes, absolutely. So a very good afternoon all the way from India. And Mustafa sir, I'm very sorry for the inconvenience with regards to the PowerPoint. So without any further ado, I'll quickly move on to my presentation. So the title of my presentation is Living in Between, Inclusion and Exclusion, and on the ambivalence of citizenship in Assam's National Register of Citizens. So could you just change the slide? Okay, so before I go on to my discussion, I'll just provide a background of what exactly is the National Register of Citizens in the Indian state of Assam. Now, so throughout South Asian history, populations have always moved across regions. Now, however, the creation of national borders, as is the case everywhere else in the world, gave birth to the category of illegal migrants, even if their movements and relations across those borders predated the formation of nation states. Now, anthropologists have thoroughly critiqued statist analysis of migration, which are largely based on demographic surveys and view migrant population as objects of policymaking and surveillance. Now, to understand the horrific experiences of migrants now, we must frame migrant illegality as a more serious concern than the fact of illegal migration. Now, the illegality of a population constructed through various discursive forms in today's world leads to overpowering denunciation, humiliation, and the rightlessness of such unwanted group. Now, against this backdrop, I move on to discussing the National Register of Citizens. The National Register of Citizens, or the NRC in Assam, sought to establish the Indian citizenship of its residents in the state of Assam and thereby weed out non-citizens. The exercise was the first of its kind in the history of the country, and it reimagined how the Indian state relates to its citizens. It was carried out following a Supreme Court order and, most importantly, under the Apex Court's continuous supervision. The National Register of Citizens has brought to the fore long-standing concern over who the state recognizes and who it deems foreign. Now, the eligibility for inclusion was to be established by producing documentary evidence. It also created a kind of a border, and it's not only a physical separation, rather it's a boundary between an inside and an outside, between those who belong and those who do not belong. At the physical level, such borders are often policed, guarded, and contested. At the conceptual level, anxieties over physical manifestation and ideological implication provoke urgent questions on the ideas of belonging and community. Now, all of these issues have become evident in the formulation of the NRC in Assam. To be recognized as citizens, residents of Assam had to provide physical documentation of documents belonging to 1971, which is the date on which Bangladesh was created. In the process, documentary evidence and oral statements converged to establish a person's citizenship. Now, the final list of the NRC was released on August 31st, 2019, whereby 1.9 million people were left out. Sir, if you could just kindly change the slide. Now, unclear of what lay ahead for the people who couldn't prove their nationality, they basically lived in a state of in-betweenness that could make them potentially stateless if they failed to prove their lineage. Now, under the NRC process, the onus shifted on to the citizen and not to the state to prove the citizenship. Sir, if you could just kindly change the slide. Now, at the heart of the creation of the NRC was the issue of the fear of the migrant. Now, the state of Assam is a border state in India's northeast, which has had a history of large-scale migration. Its tea plantation, oil fields, coal fields attracted migrant workers from eastern and central India from even during the British rule. As a result, the state went through decades of ethnic strife, militants and counter-insurgency operation as a result of the mixing of several groups of people that created a very cosmopolitan nature of the state. Now, the issue of migrant communities from what is now Bangladesh is posing a demographic, political and cultural threat to the original inhabitants of the state. And this is something which has been created by the state apparatus. And this has been induced into the consciousness of the people that migrants are posing a threat. So as you can see on the screen, from 1931 itself, the census superintendent of Assam created a kind of fear that there has been an invasion of a vast horde of land-hungry immigrants, mostly Muslims from the district of East Bengal. Wheresoever there is carcass or where there is land, the vultures or the immigrants would gather together. The only thing I can compare to is the mass movement of large body of ants. And this is how the people were dehumanized and they were reduced to ants, they were reduced to land-hungry vultures. So if you could just kindly change the screen, the slide. Again, in post-colonial era, in 1998, the Lieutenant General of Assam basically pointed out that there has been a large-scale illegal migration from East Pakistan or Bangladesh, and this has been altering the demographic complexion of the state, and it poses a grave threat both to the identity of the Assamese people and to the national security. And successive governments at the center and the state have not adequately met this challenge. Sir, if you could change the slide. Now, it is against this backdrop that there emerged a demand for the NRC, a list which sought to separate citizen from the non-citizen. It was pitched as if it was more of a magic wand that was designed to kind of solve the foreigner problem in Assam. And it was conceptualized and ideologically supported as an essential tool to check undocumented illegal migration into Assam, which I'm reminded of Benedict Anderson's specter of comparison, where he points out how forces and processes of globalization have only accentuated the fears and anxieties of losing one's identity in an increasingly globalized world, which is what I call paradox of globalization, where there is an increasing opening up of the borders, and at the same time, at the micro level, there is this fear that one would lose their identity at threat. Now, the alarmist literature against this backdrop in Assam basically draws our attention by the people who are writing this history that there has been a large horde of Bengali-speaking migrants from outside Assam who have assumed slowly intractable proportion over the years, and how these population threatens to establish the rule of foreigners in many electoral constituencies of the state. They have caused alienation of land hitherto owned by the natives. They have cut into the employment opportunities that would otherwise gone to the natives or the sons of the soil, and they have jeopardized the language and culture of the native Assamese population. So if you could just kindly change the slide. And there is a possibility that Assam would turn into a greater Bangladesh sooner or later. And against this backdrop, the NRC was projected as an essential tool to get rid of the unwanted in Assam. And this is how the policy was seen as being acceptable and mainstreamed across the political spectrum. Sir, if you could just kindly change the slide. Now, the very idea of the NRC, its fundamental premise was rooted in the insider-outsider binary, and which has led to the institutionalization of the exclusion of people. Now, the NRC, in all its arbitrariness and unfairness, has posed palpable anxiousness in the entire region. Now, contrary to the principles of natural justice, the categorization of citizenship status that considers every resident of Assam guilty until proven innocent. Now, to prove their citizenship, some people had to sell off their personal property, such as livestock, to cover great distances in order to file their papers, but with the authorities located at far off registration offices. Now, more than 100 people have lost their lives in the process of proving the citizenship, and their deaths are connected to the citizenship related issues. While some have allegedly committed suicide due to frustration, anxiety, and helplessness related to the NRC, some allegedly took their own lives via incarnation in the detention camps, as the government of India had repeatedly said that those who would be unable to prove their citizenship would be sent to the detention camps. The victims had been suffering from a paradigmatic existential crisis, totally helpless and existentially abandoned to a very chilling future, as the state had rendered its own citizens stateless post facto after they had long lived in a country. Now, the anxiety, social pain, mass distress inflicted upon the anxious citizen who had been fearing being misclassified, tens and thousands of people, especially the poor, illiterate, and the vulnerable, had been running from pillar to post, often through large distances, with old damaged documents to prove their identity. Sir, if you could just change the slide. The unfair burden on the people basically could be ascertained from the fact that people had to sell off their auto rickshaws, they had to mortgage their land, most families had lost their livelihoods in the process, and spending an average of 140 to 170 US dollars to legally defend their claims to citizenship. Now, the accumulated impact of the citizenship process in Assam has been, and on the psyche of the vulnerable, has been severe. Now, it has basically created a public life where people experience extreme loneliness, which for Hannah Arendt is the most radical experience of man, where everything becomes hopeless and bleak. For those excluded, their life basically meant being sent to the detention camps, so living a life of potential statelessness. Sir, if you could just kindly change the slide. So these are basically case studies of people who are interviewed, and these are their stories that I've tried to put onto these slides. This is after my interview, where a person had said that his wife was suffering from immense stress after the publication of the NRC list, where his name, where her name and the name of their youngest son did not come. His wife did not have any supporting documents to establish her linkage with her parents, and she had been facing social exclusion, as people around her used to call her Bangladeshi infiltrator, and also used to ask her where was her home in Bangladesh. They used to scare her by saying that the police would come and take her away, and often in the middle of the night, their 7-year-old son would wake up shivering, asking whether they would be put in a jail. Now, unable to cope up with the stress, she went missing with the son. The interviewee told me that my family is torn apart now. Will I ever be able to find my wife and son? Will our lives ever be normal again? Now, in the next case study, which is in the next slide, sir, it is basically the story of someone who had come to India, Assam, when he was 7-year-old, and he grew up here, spent his entire life here, raised his family here, and also now has his grandchildren. Now, after spending half of his life in India, now he has to prove his citizenship again. He had submitted his bank documents as part of the documents that could be used to prove the citizenship. Yet his name was not in the list for reasons best known to the officials, as they had not mentioned why they had removed him from the list. He had been called thrice to the Foreigners Tribunal, where the citizenship of people under the NRC are being declared. And those are almost 100 to 150 kilometers from his house. And he could no longer manage the expenses. He was a fruit seller, and he said that he had lost most of his life savings to battle for his citizenship. And now he said that, how much? Where will I get so much money to fight the battle? I mean, will they put me in a detention camp and deport me to Bangladesh? Will this suffering ever end? Now, in the next slide is the most, heinous of all the case studies. The picture you see is the picture of a 102-year-old man, Mr. Chandradhar Das, who was put behind the bars at this age after he was being declared a foreigner because he could not produce the documents. Sir, if you could just kindly change the slide.
Oops. Sorry.
Yeah. So basically, it was alleged that this man was residing in India without any valid documents, and hence the Foreigners Tribunal expressed his doubts over the nationality of the victim. Now, accordingly, his notice was served to him, asking him to appear before the tribunal. And because he could not appear before the tribunal because of some ailments, he was declared a foreigner, and he was sent to the detention camp. This man, who was at the fag end of his life, had to endure such kind of mental, inhuman, and physical persecution. His bail order was requested on grounds of his old age and ailments, including memory loss and hearing problems. When I interviewed his daughter, he told me this scar would never really go away from his father's life. Now, I'll quickly move on to the final slides, where I show what has been the reactions and responses of the Indian government. The government of Assam and the federal government has remained completely oblivious to the human tragedies caused by the NRC, as well as they have been silent on the question of what happens to those who are unable to prove the citizenship. No humanitarian aid and assistance have also been provided to them to prove the citizenship. Rather, these people have been dehumanized by the Union Home Minister of India, who have been calling them infiltrators and termites, and often proclaiming that they would be deported, thus perpetuating the anxieties of the victims. Sir, if you could just change the slide. The Indian government is also planning to build mass detention camps to hold the stateless population after the exercise is concluded, which reminds us of ghettos and concentration camps. Now, the Bangladesh government considers NRC as India's internal matter, ruling out the possibility of deportation and thus increasing the possibility of detention. Now, in conclusion, I would like to quickly conclude in the next slide, sir, that the complex issue of human migration beyond borders cannot be resolved by a list or a wall, and the Indian government needs to humanize the problem. Granting amnesty to the NRC rejects is the only human solution of the imbroglio, and the legislatures can start enacting a national refugee law so that the refugees are clearly defined and can be distinguished from illegal migrants, and also by forging bilateral agreements between India and Bangladesh, where the borders are so porous. Lastly, in the last slide, I conclude by saying that there is a need to move beyond a more security-driven vision of cross-border human mobility to a more fundamental human rights compliant focus, so that effects over individuals' well-being and lives are properly and systematically prioritized over security policy consideration and interest. I would like to end my discussion here, and I hope I would have your comments and suggestions on my topic. Thank you for giving me a patient hearing. Thank you, sir, for changing the
slides. Thanks so much, Debasrita. Thanks so much for that. This is great, moving from the symbolic politics of Saudi Arabia to the materialistic one along the lines of separation. I'm sure this is a great way of transition. Now we're moving to, according to the schedule, to Anne. The floor is yours as the rules of the House, 15-20 minutes, and then we'll move to the next speaker. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mustafa. I'll just share my screen. Just a second. So great, here it is. Well, it's great to be here in this virtual conference space, and I want to thank you, give a big thanks to the SEPAD team for organizing this conference. I hope, as I guess all of you do, that next year we'll be able to do a physical conference, preferably in a castle. But it's also wonderful to be here, and I've been looking forward to present some of my work in progress. So my presentation today will look into Lebanon's October uprising, and I'll talk about the different protest spaces in the city of Tripoli, which is Lebanon's second largest city, located in the north of the country. And I'll try and unpack the ways in which these spaces fostered both solidarity and divisions among protests and among Tripolitans also. It's based on field research that I conducted earlier this year within this narrow window of time where fieldwork was actually made possible. It's still very much in progress. It will become part of my PhD dissertation on the challenges of building solidarity within the Lebanese October uprising. Good. But if we have a look at protest spaces more generally, I would argue that these iconic spaces, such as the Tahrir Square, have often become romanticized as catalyzers for solidarity and cohesion across class and gender, race, political ideologies. However, if we look into the literature on space and political contention, which has emerged in recent years, we're quickly reminded, I think, that protest squares and protest spaces also produce conflicts and divisions. So how can we understand this nexus between solidarity and division within protest spaces? Well, in this work that I'm presenting today, I argue that we can get a deeper understanding of it by looking into two different dimensions of protest spaces. The first dimension is the between space dimension. So basically the relations between different locations within the same protest. Here we often see groups with ideological and tactical divisions actually having their basis in different parts of the city, different parts of the protest square. The second dimension is the within space dimension. So here we're looking at the different sites within the protest and trying to explore their unique features of cohesion and conflict, which result from the strategies they use, from the way they organize themselves, from the physical location they're in. So in my own research on the Lebanese October uprising, I've come to reflect on how we can understand solidarity and divisions in Tripoli through these two lenses, the between space and the within space lens. I've collected interview testimonies from over 50 protesters across class, age, gender, educational level, and sect, and also across the city's different areas. Not surprisingly, my interlocutors would disagree as to what fostered solidarity and what fostered division within the protests. However, most of their accounts mirrored the idea that protest spaces are in fact a nexus between solidarity and division. And as one of my interviewees put it, the protests in Tripoli was marked by what he called an imperfect solidarity, which has also become the title of this presentation. So if we look first into the within space dimension of Tripoli's protests, we can see that they were divided into several spaces and that the locus of the protest shifted over time. So three main spaces, I would argue, stand out. And the first, obviously, was the Noor Square. So like the Pearl Square in Bahrain and the Tahrir Square in Egypt, Noor Square of Tripoli was really not a public square. It was more a roundabout that had been taken over by various social movements to voice their demands. And it features, as you can see in the picture, this famous statue of the Allah in the middle, which was put up by the Tawhid movement in the 80s. And then it also features the so-called Randour building, which was decorated during the protests with a huge painting of a Lebanese flag and a scripture saying Tripoli, the city of peace. So during the first weeks, Tripoli became a center of huge mass protests. At night, there would be music concerts, and during the days, Noor was a place to hang out for people. As you can see, there are lots of different shops, vendors walking around, and I'll come back to those vendors. The second space was this one. This is a discussion tent which was located in what activists have dubbed the island. So that was an area with tent that was put up by different groups, some NGOs, some political groups, some more the activist network. And in these tents, there would be political discussions, workshops, people would even stay there overnight. And in the beginning, actually, these tents were located in Noor Square. But as activists told me, they had to relocate them after a few days because they simply couldn't have political discussions with all the noise coming from the main loudspeakers in Noor. So already here you see the spatial aspect of divisions within the protests. Finally, a third location was the Surrey in Tripoli, which is the headquarters of the governorate of North Lebanon. And they're actually located quite next to Noor Square. In fact, it's just down the main road. So here protesters started gathering at later stages in the uprising. It became sort of what you could call a base of the more radical flank of the uprising. So it was a site where there were used more disruptive and violent protests. And it was also a main site of clashes between the army and security forces on the one hand, and the protesters on the other hand. Clashes which resulted in the death of 2 young men so far. So asking interlocutors to reflect on the dynamics between those three spaces, several interesting things came up. I mean, first, it's important to say that, of course, there was an overlap between these three places in terms of participation. So you had many activists who were walking back and forth, but nevertheless, most interviewees sort of identified with a particular of these three sites, which they found most meaningful for them to be in. So there were a lot of good examples of solidarity between these three sites. and I don't have time to explain them all, but I'll highlight one, which is that the people in the tents, these people, when there were clashes here in front of the Surrey, many of them told me that they would come, even though they did not support the use of violent methods. They would stand next to the Surrey and show their solidarity with those who were engaged in clashes with the authorities. But there are also conflicts between the different protest spaces, and I think this is an example of one of the dominant conflicts, namely the conflicts between those who believed that the tents and the political discussions were a thing for the elites, and those who believed that this was actually the most meaningful way of promoting change, because here you could actually have dialogues, whereas in Noor Square it would be more superficial. People would just be together physically and dance together, but they wouldn't talk. So I think this very much illustrates how protest spaces that are usually looked at as one space are actually different locations where people compete or disagree over what is the best way of doing protests. Where should we put our efforts? Where should we be? Good. So moving to the within space dimensions, and now we've been talking about the relations between different sites within the Tripoli protest, I want to dive into the mechanisms or the happenings in just one place. And I've chosen to focus on the Noor Square again, because I think this is actually a place where I was a bit surprised when talking to people about their recollections of solidarity and division. So when asking Tripolitans to give examples of solidarity between people in Noor Square, instead of highlighting the music, the big concerts, the rituals that Noor Square became famous for in the media, in fact, they highlighted the interactions between coffee sellers, cleaning teams, food vendors, taxi drivers. So basically the exchange of gestures and favors between people from different class backgrounds and different walks of life. And I think this quote is very illustrative of this. Basically what the interviewee is saying, he's from a middle-class background. He told that the vendors would come and they would thank you so much because they would say the municipality would not allow them to sell their stuff in the square normally. But now they found a way to come to the square and make a living and at the same time actually participate in the protests. And I heard lots of different anecdotes of people telling about their encounters with the juice sellers, the kaki sellers, all those people that they would normally just pass by and ignore. Those people became agents in the protest via their encroachment. Because what I think this example illustrates and speaks to is actually Asif Bayat's concept of encroachment, which is the way in which formal economic life penetrates into occupied squares and sort of merges into the political contention in these squares. So in his book, Revolution Without Revolutionaries, Bayat describes how the informal economy actually encroached into the Tahrir Square and became an integral part of the life in the square. And people recollect the square for its vendors, for the fact that you could get everything and interact with all parts of society, also the informal ones. So this is what I see in Noor Square as well, and which I found very intriguing. But of course, there were also divisions in Noor Square. And one main division, which my interlocutors spoke about, was this encroachment, in fact, of the political life in Tripoli. So what they told me was that as days went by, Noor Square increasingly became the center of conflicts between protesters on the one hand and representatives of the political elites and their followers on the other. So basically, just as the informal economy encroached its way into the square, so did Tripoli's sectarian clientelism. And it's difficult to fact check, of course, my interviewers' testimonies, whether they were true or not, but the frequency reveals no doubt that there was heavy infiltration and presence of the political elites in Noor Square. So, for instance, the leader of the Haras al-Medina group, which was a volunteer group that guarded the square, told that he frequently had to deal with infiltrators coming in. other interviewers told me that they spotted people getting paid in the middle of the square, wondering whether they were in fact getting a salary from being in the square and overlooking it. And other protesters told that in fact they had watched what they would call, well, intelligence of local politician, mokhbars, walking around the square, basically observing and reporting back to their leaders what was going on, who was saying what. So this latent conflict really changed the atmosphere in the square, according to my interviewees. Gradually, as the political life curved its way into the square, some also told that the intelligence actually took over the main stage. People started retreating from the square. Some sought to other places. Some would go to the Surrey and start clashing with the security forces and the army, believing that radical methods was actually the next step, especially now when Noor had been taken over by the political life. Others would withdraw to the tents, believing that the most important thing they could do now was to actually engage in conversations about what alternative state they would like to have, trying to create a mini version of the society that they would like to see in the future. So when I hear these stories, I get a picture of Noor Square from when I first visited after the protest had broken out, and that was in January 2020. And all that was left in the square, basically, were the vendors, sitting around selling their stuff, people smoking shisha. So this informal life that had encroached into the Noor Square was still there, and it can still be seen as a social non-movement claiming its right to use the square. But it was definitely not the kind of role that they played in the beginning, where they interacted with other protesters and altogether created this very unique diversity and very unique multifaceted protest space. So thank you so much. I'm really interested to discussing this with you in the Q&A, and also hear your thoughts about the usefulness of this between space and within space distinction as an analytical tool to understand the spatiality of protests. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Anne. Thanks for that very insightful presentation of the spatial element of citizenship, which adds the sort of complementarity of what has been already presented so far. So moving to Khafa, the floor of you is yours, and thanks for your patience after the three previous speakers. Yeah, there you go.
All right, thanks so much. Let me share my screen first of all. All right. So this is kind of a new project of me. It's going to be kind of an overview of a chapter that's going to be published as part of an edited volume about Oman, and specifically about the Oman after the arrival of the coup that brought Sultan Qaboos to the head of state. And my intention, so the chapters is to look at the transformations that were taking place in the city of Muscat and in the rest of the country as an associated process during particularly the 1970s, what has been called the Oman Renaissance, or Nahdat Oman. But even if it's something that's going to be published, hopefully in April or something like that, I'm really taking it as the first step to get into a broader and more in-depth history of the city of Muscat specifically, but Oman in general, and basically using the city as a source. My PhD program's in history, so we're always obsessed with sources and different types of sources. So I think it's an interesting thing to do, to look into the city as a source itself. So for this chapter, I haven't included a slide in terms of theoretical framework or methodology, but I'm mostly drawing upon Henri Lefebvre's ideas of the relation between space and social interactions, and how both of them co-construct and co-define each other, and all these ideas about by mostly Marxist urbanists in France and elsewhere that take and develop this idea. And And even if I want to do this and hopefully do some field work in Muscat as soon as I can, this is mostly based on archival research. So for a little bit of context about what was happening in the 1970s, before the state of Sultan Qaboos, we have this this difference in geographical terms, in political economy, even in terms of history and leadership between inland Oman and the Sultanate of Muscat, which was basically the coasts of the current state of Oman, and one of them was mostly looking towards the Arabian Peninsula. The other one was looking towards the Indian Ocean mostly. One of the key parts of the Indian Ocean trade network since basically forever. And we also have this difference in terms of leadership. We have the Sultan in Muscat, we have the Imamate in the interior of the country. Again, very different types of leadership, very different social structures as well. As we get closer to the year 1970, when Sultan Qaboos started his sultanate, we get the war in Dhofar, in the south of the country, something that was kind of also related to Cold War politics. China was involved, the Soviet Union was involved, the British, of course, were involved, and that was one of the reasons that made the British intervene and kind of change the dynamics that were in the country at that time. We also have the exploitation of increasing or newly discovered oil reserves. We have the moment when all these revenues are starting to be available for the Sultan to invest in infrastructure, to invest in different facilities for the country, also for its citizens. After a period with Sultan Said, who was a moment when Oman and Muscat were mostly isolated and purposely isolated from the rest of the world because of a different type of idea that tried to preserve Oman from external influences, although it was pretty much controlled by the British, even if it was nominally or informally. And again, we have this Omani Renaissance with this Nahrat Oman that started with the arrival of Sultan Qaboos after the coup. So here we have a quote by Wendell Phillips, who was this archaeologist slash petroleum tycoon who went to work in Oman during the 50s and 60s. And I find it interesting because it defines Muscat as a very underdeveloped city. Now we're focusing on the city of Muscat. And I think there's a couple of interesting things here. One of them is that he analyzes the fact that Muscat has been mostly looking towards the Indian Ocean and not the rest of the country as a negative theater, when it was basically what gave the identity to the city in terms of trade, in terms of exchange of different peoples, particularly people from India and East Africa, and he stresses the role of the Banyans over there as probably the minority that was more invested in or with a most important role in terms of trade and connections with the rest of the Indian Ocean. So here we have this is a picture taken from the Indian Office records, but retrieved from the Qatar Digital Library. So we see how the geographical features of Muscat are very defining in terms of what the city could and could not do. Historically speaking, we see it's pretty much, it's hard, or it was hard before Qaboos started investing in roads and stuff, to move from Muscat to the rest of the country. It was actually easier to go by sea from port to port in the whole coastal cities of Oman, until again some new roads were being created by the Sultan. So this kind of explains or helps understand the reasons why Muscat was more specifically, again, the city, the old city of Muscat was more looking towards the Indian Ocean rather than the rest of the sea. So we have here Matra. it's a complete different type of port, much more open. Now Matra is part of the greater Muscat, which is one of the key transformations that I'm going to be talking about in this presentation. How Muscat, the old Muscat, which was just this tiny port city, became greater Muscat, incorporating different urban spots that were distributed in this land. And Matra was if Muscat was the seat of political power and legitimacy for the Sultan, Matra was the commercial port by definition, and still is. Here's where we have Mina Qaboos, which is a new facility that was created to welcome bigger ships and kind of put Greater Muscat and the Sultanate of Oman in general into the new trading routes and kind of bring it to modernize it in terms of technology and participation in the global economy. So when the Sultan starts the Sultan Qaboos, starts the Sultanate in Oman, we have in general across the Gulf this frantic diplomatic activity, not just with Oman but also with Qatar, the Emirates, when they get independence in 1971. There's a lot of interviews. Here's an example from the Egyptian magazine Rose Al Youssef, and again they stress. I guess in the case of Oman was already independent, but in the case of other Khaliji countries, they were stressing trying to put their countries into the as newly independent countries into the conversation regionally and internationally. One of the vehicles that they used was the Palestinian cause. They all talk about the Palestinian cause, kind of trying to take that cause as a way to present themselves as key actors within the Arab countries. And they also, of course, stress all the new investments that are taking place in the country, in the case of Oman and also in the other countries in the Gulf. So there's three groups of reforms that I've basically found going into these archives to look into Oman. In terms of infrastructure, we have a new set of investments, particularly regarding sea and road infrastructure. Again, we see this difference between Muscat, the old Muscat, which was that picture that we're showing before, to greater Muscat, which includes, again, very different urban areas. And again, drawing on this Lefebvrean idea of the relation between social structures and space, we have also very different populations that now become part of this same urban nucleus. We have Oman is a particularly diverse country if we compare it to other Khaliji countries, which has Arabs, of course, but there's also Baluchis, historically speaking, as well. Banyans, there's the Lawatis, which is a very identity-specific community in Muscat. That there's this place, which is actually very close to Matra, where most of these the descendants are concentrated right now. There's East African slaves and not slaves. There's the Zanzibaris, which is a particularly important group of people in Oman. Even today, there's actually Crystal Ennis is working on a project about young Omanis and their issues with finding jobs. And there's this recurring idea about Zanzibaris who arrived in Oman in the 1970s as a consequence of the revolution and the new openness of the country with Sultan Qaboos. And they basically took over all the jobs that were being created in the private sector, particularly in the oil industry. So there's this thing that Arab Omanis particularly say that, or Omanis that were in Oman before Zanzibaris came back, that they cannot find a job because it's Zanzibaris took all the jobs. It's this recurrent idea. Again, there's this concept of the miraculous Qaboos that particularly in the Arab press is everywhere in all the interviews. Some journalists refer to the road of 1,000 miles because all the port cities in Oman were being connected, or in Muscat to be more specific, were connected with one another. All Muscat, again, was connected with all these different urban areas, and investments such as Port Qaboos in Matra were being created, which also had an effect by basically eliminating or displacing at least all the key role that those had in the region, and were displaced either to smaller ports and in general had less volume of trade. And also what was happening in terms of, again, infrastructure in Muscat was being copied by other urban areas. And the case of Salalah is particularly relevant because of the Dhofari issue and everything. Salalah, again, is in the south of the country. So if we Google Muscat right now, we get this picture. This is the territorial boundaries of the city of Muscat, or Greater Muscat, we should probably say. But this is a very different Muscat to the Muscat that was before Sultan Qaboos, which only referred to the easternmost part of the city, the old Muscat that I was showing before. And if we clean the map, we can see how many different urban areas we have here, again, with very different ratios of different populations. So again, this transition from Muscat as a tiny port that was more connected with the sea to a greater Muscat that has very different urban areas connected with one another shows how this Lefebvrean idea of social space creating or co-creating social structures is actually playing out as a key part of the state building efforts of Sultan Qaboos in the 1970s and after that too. We have also new developments like the neighborhood of Rui, which was mostly for new diplomats. Again, as I was saying, there was a frantic diplomatic activity during these years. We have the Sultan Qaboos University, which was created by these around these years as well, the airport, all this. In terms of politics, we have this process that I've called the Omanization of Muscat and the Muscatization of Oman, where even if the Imamate of Oman and the Sultanate of Muscat were nominally under the same rule after the Treaty of Sèvres in 1920, it was after 1970 when the country became the Sultanate of Oman as an Ibadi country, the whole thing, with the Sultan being the Sultan of Oman, including the whole country and Muscat, all the coastal areas. And one of the key elements in terms of politics, or the key reforms that Sultan Qaboos starts to put in place, is to bring people from the Imamate into key government posts from the Imamate, as the case of the Al-Khalili family, which was a key family in terms of religious legitimacy as well, and some Dhofari key figures like the one that I have on the presentation. And as well, Qaboos connects the inland Oman with the capital and other areas. So there's some figures like the walis, which start losing relevance in the 1970s, but serve as a point of connection between the Sultan, which was the one that was naming those walis, but was pretty much either naming a member of the Abu Saidi, the ruling family, or a local sheikh. So there's this idea that Sultan Qaboos becomes, or wants to become, some kind of sheikh of sheikhs in the area, trying to get further contact with the whole country, but also preserving these structures, and also recurring to some performances of power, like the Jawla Sawaniya, which is basically it gets back to the prophetic tradition of visiting the territories of the ruler, but in terms of in this case in the new Sultanate of Oman. And finally, in terms of cultural institutions, we have the Amani Museum, which was a forum, which was a new development, interestingly enough. And it was this part of this new wave of Khaliji museums that was taking place during the 1970s, not the architecture thing that we can see now, and with the National Museum of Qatar and all these, this architectural projects that we can see. And it was more about developing a national narrative in terms of traditions and these things. And interestingly enough, a key part of the narrative of this museum, which is now a different one, this one was closed and moved to a different place, is that it paid particular attention to the Jebel Akhtar region and Nizwa as the old capital of this region and the Imamate in general, and not so much the Indian Ocean, which was the key point of connection with the Sultanate with the rest of the area. But again, highlighting the role of Sultan Qaboos specifically, but the whole Al Busaidi family in terms of unifying the country. So in this sense, Muscat appears as some kind of anti-Dubai in terms of the different regulations and architecture. If we just see the urban landscape of Muscat is so different to Dubai, for instance, as the paradigmatic Khaliji city or architectural Khaliji city, if you will. So to conclude, we see a really fast modernization / urbanization that reproduce the social aspects that Sultan Qaboos is trying to bring into this new Sultanate of Oman, that is best embodied by the example or the creation of the new connection of Muscat with the rest of these urban areas as the idea of Greater Muscat. Again, this reproduces the project that is the centralizing project that is taking place in the country, but again, preserving the local regimes of authority that were in place before. Again, Muscat becomes more like Oman, and Oman becomes more like Muscat, as the city itself is telling us. And that's all for me. Really looking forward to your feedback. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Javier, for giving this historical perspective to space as well. That's very thought-provoking. And we have around 20 minutes for discussions or a bit more. So please, for everyone, do really appreciate if you can start posting your question in the Q&A rather than the chat box. That would make life easier for all of us. And I can see 2 questions. The first one is from Jacob Erickson to Anne. Thanks. I'm not quite sure, Anne, if you can read it, but I'll do that loudly and clearly as possible. Thanks, Anne, for that wonderful paper. I wonder if those more confrontational protesters have also expressed a political preference for the future that was different from the intellectual elites, quote and unquote, discussing and debating. In other words, are there any differences in the political vision in addition to differences in methods and class? Another question from Simon Mabin. Amazing presentations, really fascinating stuff. I have a question for AK. This is the acronym for, and as we know it among us CPAT fellows. Can you elaborate a little more on the theoretical ontological foundations of in space, between space? Also, I'm curious about the reasons for protesters picking public spaces which are symbolic but not necessarily pedestrian sites. What is it about them that makes them good choices? Thanks. These are the 2 questions to Anne, and actually I have a number of questions as well. I can start shooting off once you answer them for the other speakers as well. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much for both of these 2 questions.
Do you want to go ahead and answer them?
I think she
Hello?
froze, Mustafa.
Yeah. So probably until we get Anne, I have a question for Aziz regarding the symbolic politics. How this interaction of symbolic politics in the case of Saudi Arabia is actually part of an interplay with materialistic politics. How these gestures are actually being supported, augmented by what is materialistic, given this kind of the richier political culture that we have in Saudi Arabia in one way or another.
Yeah, Mustafa, that's a good question, because I think that was one of that you highlighted here, one of the challenges that I had. So here, and I think I touched upon it in one of the slides where I said presidents and actions. And the thing is that what I meant there is that it is in those actions that we start to see the materialization of some people's fears. So when people fear, a particular kind of reaction from someone, and particularly from the mid-level, it does influence and does affect that kind of it does have an interplay with the symbolic. And as a result, people then answer symbolically or appropriately, because this particular action that has taken place, this precedent, this materialistic reaction is there. It can't be avoided. So you know, and I think it's that interplay between the symbolic that makes people sometimes answer things appropriately, engage with aspects in a very symbolic manner, because they know that at times, you know, in other words, there's a symbolic order, and then there's a more authoritative order. And I think that's perhaps what the question that, you know, what you highlighted in the question. And it is in those interactions between themselves that makes it very, very confusing for people. And it not only makes it confusing for people for how to behave, hence why they behave very symbolically and appropriately, but it's also very difficult for us to understand this kind of phenomenon and interplay. So I'm not sure if I answered your question. I tried to do it, but I hope that made sense.
Yeah. Thanks, Aziz. It makes. I have a question for Debasrita and then Kafir. It's fascinating, Debasrita, that this kind of struggle for independence and citizenship, and it's really sad that takes a bit of very oppressive atmosphere of dominance and resistance is not the easiest way forward. I'm just wondering about the external factor. I mean, the geopolitics of India when it comes to all these kind of ready accusation as conspiratorial. For someone coming from the Middle East, I can actually relate to this kind of the mention of conspiracy as one kind of tactic or strategy of survival and legitimating the position either of the state or the counter-state narratives as well. If this is kind of a bit of part of the equation when it comes to this kind of resistance or not. And Khafir, I'm just wondering about, you mentioned just insightfully all these kind of literature coming from the past about the image of the historical image that comes with Oman and Muscat. And I'm wondering about this, how I hope that just you would forgive me for asking that question, the Orientalist bent when it comes to these kind of perceptions and constructions. Just now everyone is talking about decolonizing curriculum and just academia. Perhaps it's a great, this is kind of what is there as part of the perceptions of Oman as secretive geopolitical important state or not. Thanks so much for that. And by the way, we have Anne as well. I'm not quite sure. Okay, this is the limbo position of answering questions. So Anne, can you please answer the two questions that you have first, and then we move to Khafir and then Debasrita, please. Thanks so much for that.
Thank you so much, Mr.
Great to have you back.
Well, great to be back. This is the curse of the Zoom webinars and conferences, internet connections. Once they fail, you're kicked out. But luckily, I got mine to work again. So yeah, as I said before, my connection cut. I really like these two questions. And to begin with the first one, Jacob, these people who participated in the more violent, disruptive protests can be divided into two groups, and those two groups have, I would say, quite different views on what should be the solution to the Lebanese crisis. So the first group are the leftists. There is a communist society in Tripoli, which has been quite active in the protest movement, and that sort of speaks for itself. They want a socialist state, or a communist state, in fact, so many of them. And then there's a group of young unemployed men who were spending most of their time, in fact, in the protest movement. And I've been talking to many of them, and basically what they say is that they want things to get better. So this is actually one of the dilemmas that the protests are facing now. Should you accept that people do not know what the solution is and just want to have a space to express their anger? Or should you engage in a conversation with these men about what it is that they actually want? I think this is a very interesting question, but I would say that definitely there is an overrepresentation of the lower classes, the male members of the lower classes in these violent demonstrations, but it's not it's not all of them who are unemployed, underemployed young men. There are university students as well, and girls as well, taking part in these clashes. Yeah, and as for Simon's question, and I'll have to just have another look at it. Yeah, so I see it's been dismissed, but Simon, you asked about the space and whether certain spaces are chosen because of their features. And I would say there are two reasons for why protesters choose the space they choose. One reason is that it's practical. I mean, for the tent city, they needed a space that was more quiet, but where they could still recruit people from the Noor Square and not just be, you know, within their own bubble. So they went to the Noor Square, recruited people, told them, why don't you come back to our tents? We have a discussion about citizenship or about livelihoods. The Noor Square obviously was also chosen for its symbolic role, more than just being a traffical focal point in Tripoli. It's also been a place where various social movements have gathered. Also the Islamists who have demanded the release of their sons from Lebanese prisons, they have usually gathered there. So it's a place where you're used to see political contention. I think this is also one of the reasons. A second reason is that it's located in the center of the city. Everyone passes by, so it's a space where people are used to be. People from the higher classes are used to passing by there in the car. People from the lower classes are used to passing by in services or walk there by foot. And as for the Surrey, obviously, this is the most direct way you can confront the authorities. So this is why they chose the Surrey, to face the regime directly.
That's great. So we have the Khafir and the Bastrita, please, and then we move to the Q&A questions coming across. Thanks.
Yeah, sir, am I audible? Am I audible? Am I audible, sir?
You are perfect.
Okay.
Thanks so much for that.
Thank you so much for your question, sir. You had asked about the role of geopolitics in creating the humanitarian crisis created by the citizenship struggle in India. Sir, you're absolutely right. When we speak of geopolitics, I would like to highlight about the porous borders between India and Bangladesh. And this is something which has complicated the issue furthermore. Human migration has become all the more complicated because of the porous borders that exists between India and Bangladesh. And this has been a long-standing issue, especially since the state of Assam shares a very close, long, and a very porous border, mostly riverine border with Bangladesh. Cross-border migration has been very much possible, especially since border surveillance is not that strong. And since I've mentioned it's a riverine border, it's not possible to fence the entire border. Also, most areas, land borders have mostly remained unfenced. So these are mostly strategic issues which the Indian state has conveniently overlooked. And rather, it has created a very complex citizenship procedure to kind of deal with the problem of illegal migration, subjecting the entire population of Assam to a very scrupulous and a very violent form of citizenship determination exercise, where the entire population basically turned suspect citizens overnight. And now more than 1.9 million people, they are living in a state of potential statelessness. So conveniently, all the strategic issues that the Indian state needs to take up with regards to fencing the borders, with regards to having bilateral agreements with neighboring countries, so that the problem of human migration and mobility is effectively handled by both the states, taking into consideration a human-centric approach rather than a security-driven approach. These issues have been overlooked, and rather we are now in the middle of a citizenship crisis where, citizens and residents in Assam, they have turned stateless after living in the state for more than, for several decades. And like I've also mentioned in my presentation, innumerable people have also lost their lives, and the psychological effects is something that cannot really be put into words. So I hope I could answer some parts of your question, sir, if that is what you had wanted to know.
Yeah, exactly. So thanks so much for mentioning this kind of, it's complicated issue. Sadly, I can relate to many cases elsewhere as well. So thanks so much, Basrita. And Khafir, please, before we move to the Q&A. Thanks.
Thanks a lot for your question. Yeah, there's definitely a massive degree of Orientalism in many of the sources that I've been dealing with. First, British colonial sources are by definition colonial sources. There's also this idea about Khaliji countries being just oil, which, I mean, it's more complicated than that, I guess. And that's why I'm so, like, I want to use the city itself as a source to kind of avoid all these depictions or outside depictions of the country. And that's why I was also diving into magazines in mostly Egyptian and Lebanese. But at the same time, these magazines also fall into some kind of Orientalism. What Rosie Bashir in Archive Wars defines as second degree Orientalism. Because you see Egyptians, particularly during the times of Nasser, were like, yeah, it's just Khalijis. And if you look at the cartoons in those magazines, it's just that. It's shields with an oil drilling thing that define this country. So definitely. And also some kind of self-imposed Orientalism. When we look into the narrative of the museum, because that museum doesn't exist anymore, but I had the opportunity to look at the different leaflets that they had during the 70s. And it kind of reminded me to what happened in Morocco with colonial powers that defined what the idea of being Moroccan is. And then the independent country kind of bought into those ideas defined by colonizers, by French and Spanish colonizers. In the case of Oman, I think there's an opportunity to get into that and check if that's the case as well or not. So yeah, definitely, there's Orientalism everywhere. Thanks.
Thanks, Javier. And I imagine this is very interesting, this sort of Arab Orientalism coming across when it comes to the Gulf. Aziz, I can see in the Q&A you have two questions from Andrew McIntosh presented yesterday about Bahrain insightfully. I think that you can read the question, but I'll read it loudly just in case not everyone is seeing that. Unless you want to read it, just it's all yours. My question is for Aziz. The political language of good conduct and gesturing can be multifaceted with both socio-cultural and political components. For instance, this kind of social politeness is also present in certain liberal democracies such as Japan and until 2015, 2016, the United States. Do you believe this ordering of language is state-constructed discourse, or has this kind of polite language been pasteurized by the state? What are the cultural historical factors? And I can see another questions coming from Javier. This is our Javier Bourdon. Thanks everyone for these insightful presentations. I would like to pose a question to Aziz. When it comes to the bottom interaction level in your approach in the making, would you say the citizens' appropriateness comes to being in an iterative process, or is it more speech act, one-time action, something in between, or none of these at all? Here you go.
Yeah, well, thank you guys for the questions, and I think I'll take Javier's point of Orientalism as a point of departure here, because I think speaking about speaking about aspects of appropriateness, and sometimes, in my opinion, I think people might be too worried that they're entering into this Orientalist kind of realm, but I don't think so. I think culture plays a very, very big role here. And I think what propagates this symbolic order, and to answer Andrew's question here, is that indeed, what facilitates this, what makes this this hierarchy of ruling elite, etc., present, is because it is already entered into this culture. The culture in itself, and this appropriateness in itself, is the most overarching aspect that this system of governance has entered in. In other words, the system of governance and this hierarchy and the government, etc., has then entered into this symbolic realm, this realm of appropriateness, due to the culture that has a lot of symbolism in it. There's a lot of symbolism in Saudi Arabia. Unlike probably other, for example, Lisa Wedeen's work and her work on Syria, I think there needs to be more effort by the regime there to use symbolism, because I don't think they're, you know, the Assad regime is close to being as symbolic or has symbolic baggage as Saudi Arabia do. I mean, it's a monarchy. It's based on religion. It's Arabia. It's been there, you know, the beacon of Islam, from the place where, you know, the beacon of Islam came out from. So this symbolic history does a lot of the heavy load of this structure, of this order. You know, it is entered into this. So I think indeed, I think it's the former. You know, I think I don't think. And there's another point here that I wanted to mention, which is I really wanted to expand upon the mid-level in those three levels: the ruling elite, the mid-level, and the social. The mid-level for me, I think, is very interesting because, you know, there is influence by officials regarding how conduct and the language is conducted, but they do it because, you know, in that mid-level, it is the nexus where the social overlaps with the authority. And that is precisely what makes this symbolic order also perpetuate and be maintained, because that's you know, so that's a very crucial element in that point. That's where perhaps the main source, the beacon of where the government plays a particular role in structuring language. So that's to answer Andrew's question. I hope I answered the question, Andrew. And I think to Javier's point, you know, I really appreciate this question, because it is more irritability than it is a one-time ad hoc kind of response. It's in some ways it is becoming now a web of references, a web of principles, that this is the kind of discourse that ought to be happening, that this is the framework, the bounds in which we should really be communicating in within the social or the bottom. So I think it is more iterable. It is constantly mentioned back and forth, and for me, what I think the only thing that, as I mentioned, you know, really changes is how the conspiracy, the state of exception, you know, influences that. That's the only thing that I find that could change and be a different speech act. But the rest, I think, is very much fixated, and so therefore it helps with this iterability. I hope I answered the question. Hope that made sense.
Thanks, Aziz. It's great, and I'm trying to. I've used my position for the panel, and I would love to ask you, because it's amazing, this kind of nice combination of scholars coming from different, focusing on different countries and coming from different countries. I want to ask about the challenges of field work. And just, you mentioned this kind of a great, very nice anecdotal evidence coming from the ground. And I keep wondering, just this, when it comes to the reliability of the data, how detached or attached you become to your subjects in the very hostile, very contentious politics like the case in Lebanon. And Srita, it's a great, fascinating work that you introduced to us, the case of Assam and how's it working. How you, because I'm all the time I'm Egyptian, I'm working on Egypt, so I'm trying to keep this kind of space between my passionate interest in what I do and, okay, the neutrality of being a researcher. And perhaps, Aziz, okay, you're the gem here, a Saudi scholar working on Saudi Arabia on this bottom-up approach. I imagine that you have own challenges, and Khafir, of course, when it comes to the Gulf politics, the sensitivity of carrying field work. Do you plan to do so? What are the challenges? It's great for us, for those who are interested in visiting these countries, or as well as seeing how you manage in one way or another. We have a kind of 5 minutes, so please feel free to shut us up into these kind of the answers into the question.
Yeah, maybe I can start as the one who was mentioned first. Well, obviously, it's not easy to do fieldwork in a setting like Lebanon, especially when you are coming from a Western country. Well, there are several things I noticed from my research in Tripoli, which puzzled me and really helped me understand how I am perceived, so how others see my positionality when I'm in the field. And I think two maybe small anecdotes can also help convey how doing fieldwork is in a setting like Tripoli. So the first anecdote, and those are very brief, of course, is that I wanted to do small informal interviews with people from lower class backgrounds. So these young men, actually, I wanted to get them to talk and hear their perspectives. And I got an interlocutor to help me who comes from one of these areas himself. And we agreed to just stand in the middle of North Square, and then he would point out who he had seen in the protest. And we would approach this person and speak to the person. I was very reluctant in the beginning to even approach people by myself and to even ask if I could get the possibility to record what they're saying. But actually, they were happy to be approached because they were full of opinions that they wanted someone to hear. They were standing in North Square already, trying to voice their concerns. And they were actually, they thought it was nice to see someone like me coming. And so I was a bit surprised actually that they didn't see me as an intruder. And I believe also it had to do with me bringing along my interlocutor who knew them and who could sort of vouch for me. Another interesting anecdote is an interview I did in Tripoli with someone who actually called our common friend and asked if I was an Orientalist, because if I were, she would not like to speak to me, and she had been declining a lot of people who came to Tripoli to do research and other types of interviews, simply because she didn't want to hear all those prejudices about her society and her city. And then my friend, who's also one of my main interlocutors, told her, no, Anna, she's been spending a lot of time in Lebanon. And of course, I'm modest about my knowledge about Lebanon and its culture, but I think it does help just spending time and talking to people and engaging with people on all sorts of questions that do not necessarily relate to your research question, but it gives you a legitimacy that you cannot get otherwise. So yeah.
Thanks for sharing that. Just Aziz.
Yeah, I talked a lot. So would it be okay if it was Dabrasita could go before me?
Dabrasita, please. Do you want to go ahead?
Yes, absolutely, sir. Am I audible?
Yeah, please. Yes, we can hear you perfectly.
Okay. So basically, I had conducted almost 60 interviews before for my citizenship project. And also this project was part of my MPhil, Master of Philosophy dissertation, where I basically tried to understand the humanitarian crisis that has been created by the citizenship register in Assam. Now, what worked in my favor was the fact that I belonged to the state. And so there was, my positionality as somebody from Assam basically helped me get access or to people who are kind of facing the problem. Secondly, as Anne has mentioned, when I started speaking to people, they were, quite surprisingly, all the more interested to voice out their opinions, to voice out the problems that they were facing, because they wanted the country and the world to know the vulnerabilities that the Indian state is basically made them go through. So, and in also cases where I felt that, I wanted to gather some information which I couldn't gather, quite directly, I basically started informal talks and discussions, asking them how exactly has the citizenship issue affected you in your everyday life? How has citizenship affected, how are you being affected in your everyday life? So basically with this particular starting point, I could gather information that was not directly related to my research, but at the same time that opened up pathways for me to delve deeper into questions that ultimately helped me bring up different aspects of the citizenship problem, not just from political science point of view, but also from human rights and humanitarian point of view. So these are a few things. The fact that I belonged to the state, the second thing that people were, I mean, given the vulnerability, they were all the more interested to talk to me. And thirdly, the fact that I resorted mostly on taking informal interviews of people at the local level, and then I moved on to asking them the questions, if not directly, but kind of indirectly, to what led me to the research that I have been able to do and I'm continuing to do. So I hope that helps people who want to work on this area.
Yeah, it's great. That's a nice
yes.
a great way of breaking the ice. Aziz and Khafir, thanks so much for that, Basrita. Aziz and Khafir, sorry, we have kind of 1 minute for each. That would be lovely. I know that just it's getting more interesting, but yeah, time is it's pushing us. Please.
I'll be honest with one of the reasons why the field, I personally find field work here in Saudi Arabia to be difficult, and I think me being Saudi does help in me understanding these responses. But I think me as a researcher, it doesn't help. I believe personally, people that are not Saudi have better access to information than the Saudi, and this is the problem that I have with these other Saudis that I keep talking to them about and saying, listen, you guys want to help Saudis write about Saudi, then help Saudis write about Saudi if you want the world to understand Saudi better. But so this leaves a vacuum that others tend to have. Why? Because they think, is Aziz really a student, or is he disguised as a student? Is he an informant, or is he someone that's testing our loyalty? And it goes back to this thing that I mentioned here of a president's actions, that there are these, in the sentiments, that there are people that are constantly worried. As a result, you get this symbolic answer. In other words, the symbolic, appropriate, one can even say the safe answer. So me as a researcher, I think what I have is that I could understand the language, the logics, but I think the actual field work itself is more challenging for me than it is for others, in my opinion.
Thanks, interesting insight. Khafir, final word?
Yeah, I think I was going to point out exactly the same as Aziz was saying, because what I've noticed as a Spaniard, as a European researcher that talks to people in the Gulf, I mean, Oman as well is not the Emirates, so there's a higher degree of availability of people willing to talk to you. But at the same time, access to some colleagues who are either from Oman, or when we talk about the Emirates, in the Emirates, they mentioned that it's harder for them not just to talk to people because they found them suspicious in any way, but also access to archives and documents. It's like, I'm not gonna let you in because you're from here. It's kind of weird that you do this, but as a European, it's been easier for me to do these things. I've noticed. I don't know if that's the case for everyone or not, but.
Thanks so much for that amazing answer. And I can say, Aziz saying that I totally agree with AK, because she suggested joint research projects. This is great. It's nice to collaborate on this a very happy note and a desire for cooperation, and I really appreciate. Thanks so much. I would like to thank everyone. This fantastic lineup of scholars coming here, interesting insights across the borders, far afield. As well. Thanks for being here. And play, the next session is coming very soon. Keep tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you very, very, very soon. Thanks so much for that, everyone.